Thanks. Tremendous honor to be here. I want to begin by revisiting a bar chart that Chris Field put up earlier this morning. This is coming from a paper we published a year ago implicating Pete Smith as well, who was involved, 3 other co-authors. Our goal with this was to estimate the climate mitigation potential across all of the explicit additional actions that we could identify and quantify, ranging across forests, grasslands, agricultural systems, and wetlands. So terrestrial climate mitigation opportunities and disaggregate those. And we began by looking at the maximum mitigation potential. We put some safeguards on that, but maximum with safeguards of food security and fiber security and biodiversity. And that's those open bars on the far left. And then we looked at the proportion of that maximum that can be delivered at 2 different price points, with an emphasis on the gray bar there, which is what we call the 2-degree ambition. So that's at the social cost of carbon of $100, assuming $100 per ton of CO2. How much can we deliver for that, which is considered essentially the amount of money that society will need to pay across all sectors to deliver on the Paris Climate Agreement. So I realized that the font size is really small here, so I just want to kind of run through a couple of highlights that what I think of the top 3 are the largest options: reforestation, afforestation, avoided forest conversion, natural forest management. And again, I'm just running through some examples here so you can see them better. A whole variety of different agricultural options, and then wetland restoration and avoided wetland impacts, both in freshwater peat systems and in saltwater systems. The punchline of this analysis was that if we were to add up all of those light gray bars, those so-called sort of cost-effective levels of limitation, we could deliver 37% of the needed mitigation between now and 2030, cost-effectively. What we've done is essentially downscaled this conceptual approach of analysis to we're launching this in a couple of different countries. We're the first of this being in the United States, being led by colleague Joe Fargione. So this is from a paper that will come out actually in a couple of weeks in Science Advances, looking at essentially the range of options in the U.S. Basically the same primary set of options with a few additions. Actually, we now have urban reforestation in there, and avoided grassland conversion, which actually ended up being the largest of the agricultural. But the punchline on this particular study is that actually all of the U.S.'s NDCs could be delivered through these land-based options. We think of these as primarily sort of tropical and low-income country kind of story, but in fact, it's very much a story in developed countries. Now this is where I'm going out really on a limb. Needless to say, these sorts of actions are not, in most cases, not primarily driven by climate mitigation. That's not when we do these things. So what are the other things that we should be considering in prioritizing investment in this range of options? Others here are much greater experts on other climate considerations. Some of these are sort of what we refer to as adaptation, I think, but I'm not actually sure which of these would fall into adaptation. But I wanted to run through what, for my brain, would be sort of 4 other climate outcome considerations that we might use to prioritize these sorts of actions. And just do that by way of an example. So that these are color ramps. In the case of the mitigation, the darkest green is for the highest mitigation opportunities for those forest pathways. And the red are sort of risks, sort of higher risk and deeper red, and benefits and deep. So a simple example, if we had an option of protecting a hectare of mangroves, so that would be in this avoided coastal wetland kind of impacts category. We might decide, great, there's actually, even though this is globally not quite as much as reforestation, the very high density of carbon storage, we might decide to do that, except for the fact that, well, with sea level rise, there's a tremendous exposure of a given hectare of mangroves to destruction, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. So we might say that's a problem to deprioritize that. On the other hand, these systems essentially buffer, are a buffer human impact. So that might be a reason to say, oh no, we should actually instead prioritize that. And then, of course, there's the question of ecological resistance and resilience. Because they're exposed to these are fringing ecosystems, they're also very resilient. And then finally, some of these are non-deferrable. So when you're talking about a loss of a system, once it's lost, you don't have the option of doing it later, whereas, say, reforestation, you could. So that's just to brainstorm with you. By the way, none of those are, aside from the mitigation, everything else is just numbers. I mean, just levels I made up. Pure folly in a group like this that knows more than me. But the idea is to just brainstorm with you. Are those the right categories? Are we kind of getting the basic concepts there, or are there should be different categories? And of course, there are a whole bunch of other things we can talk about for prioritizing these actions. Finally, then I'm totally brushing over the spatial complexity of these questions. There's the question of action mapping. I think it was it Nancy that mentioned action mapping? This is something that we're doing now. The Nature Conservancy colleagues, Mark Anderson, developing essentially maps of natural resilience of these systems. We're actually using these maps now to prioritize our conservation work. Thanks.